months ago when we first began to hear about it. Our study tonight is concerning, again, the answering of religious errors of our family, friends, and neighbors. And the error that we're talking about tonight comes in many statements. So that's why the statement I have is fairly long, because I wanted to include as much, if not all, of the statements that may be heard in regards to the Lord's Supper. So, to put it all together, what we're studying tonight is that the Lord's Supper may be observed any day of the week, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, and annually. And of course, different religious groups have different frequency as far as to when they observe. So that is really just a putting together of all of the different times that you're likely to hear the statements made concerning the frequency in which many churches partake of the Lord's Supper. See, this matter of how often to partake of the Lord's Supper, we can see from that statement it varies. It varies among the different churches, and that's what this statement is a reflection of. Different churches practice different times to partake. And as we've always wanted to be as perfectly honest as we can, not just to sort of paraphrase or sum up ourselves the things that churches believe. We want rather to hear their own words in the matter, so to be sure that we're not misrepresenting, that we're not adding something more to what it is that they believe. So, in our quotes, this is from the United Methodist Church website, umc.org. An interesting quote. As Methodist clergy in the late 1700s, when the denomination first got started, a pastor who could administer communion and baptism was on a circuit traveling around. They might be going to 12 different places. They may be going to 20 or 30 churches on those circuits, which means they couldn't be in every church every Sunday. So what happened was the pastor always gave communion when he got to a church. And he might get to that church once a month, maybe once every 2 months. We were used to that. And then as our pastors went on shorter and shorter circuits to ultimately just serving just 1 or 2 or maybe 3 churches, that habit has just stayed with us. So our communion happens maybe once a month in some churches. In some places, it's maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And it's just part of our history. So look at what we're seeing by means of justifying the frequency in which they partake of the Lord's Supper. And of course, what you got to keep in mind is that statement where it says a pastor who could administer communion and baptism. Of course, we understand, I'm sure most of us do, what the denominational concept of the pastor is. We know that to denominational folks, the pastor is the preacher. And so what they're saying is that only the preacher can serve communion. Only the preacher can do the baptizing. And that leads to what the practice had to be whenever these pastors were going circuit riding among a multiplicity of churches. Another quote, this is from the same website. Excuse me. The Hisark Guide for Baptist Churches. See, this ain't the same website. I'm sorry, I've got a duplicate, but this is the duplicate. Excuse me. The Hisark Guide for Baptist Churches, entitled The Standard Manual for Baptist Churches, states only that churches have an option as to when and how often they will serve communion, and that the practice has become to serve on the first Sunday of the month. Some rely on Bible passages in Acts and 1 Corinthians, stating that Christians in the early churches met each Lord's Day to break bread, to support their position that communion should be observed every Sunday. I think that's interesting. They got their practice for the first Sunday of the month, but they acknowledge that the first century, the church in the first century, yes, they partook of the Lord's Supper every week. And this is the second quote. A Mayo survey conducted in 2012 by Lifeway Research indicates that 57% of Southern Baptist churches serve communion on a quarterly basis. The survey was sent to Southern Baptist church pastors. A total of 1,066 surveys were completed. The same survey indicated that 15% of those churches serve communion 5 to 10 times per year. 8% serve it less than 4 times annually. A mere 1% of Southern Baptist churches serve communion each week, according to the survey. So notice 57% do it quarterly, 4 times a year. 15% do it in an auto ranging from 5 to 10 times in a year's time. Less than 4 times a year, 8%. And only about 1% observe it weekly. And of the interesting quotes that I have, I find this next one to be by far the most interesting. The New Testament does not give a conclusive answer to how often the Lord's Supper should be held, for the church is at liberty on such an issue. Thank you. Notice that. The New Testament does not give a conclusive answer as to how often, and so the church is at liberty. Now, the reason I said, to me, that's an interesting quote, is that comes from www.christianity.com. And that is a website that is sponsored by Pepperdine College in California, a Church of Christ website, sort of like we're familiar with the ones that are closer at hand, and that would be Lipscomb and Hardeman. But this is supposed to be those professing themselves to be members of the Lord's church, and yet they make this kind of statement. It's truly interesting to me. And as always, in all of our studies, in looking at statements that we hear and trying to determine whether those statements are in harmony with God's will or whether they are at odds, if they are in error with God's will, we always want to ask this question. And that is, what do the scriptures teach concerning how often the Lord's Supper is to be served? We know, first and foremost, Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. And he instituted it as a memorial of his death. 1 Corinthians 11, verses 23, 24, and 25. Brother Gerald, would you read that for us?
For I received from the Lord that which also I delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus Christ, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me."
I would dare say that hardly a month goes by for what whoever it is that is officiating for the Lord's Supper on any given Sunday is very likely to quote these verses that Brother White has just read for us. But what I want us to do is notice verse 26. And Tim, would you read verse 26?
For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes.
So notice that verse. And notice it says, as often as. That little phrase indicates regularity. So that brings with it the question, how often? You see, we can't read verse 26 and read the part that says, as often as, without asking that question. I mean, it's just natural. How often? Now, we've already seen what man's practice to the answer of how often. We've looked at those quotes just a moment ago. Some say that often is once a month. Some say that it's once a quarter, once every 3 months. Others say it's once a year. So we know what man's practice and what man's answer to verse 26 is, as often as. But again, we're concerned with what the scriptures teach. And the scriptures teach that the Lord's Supper was observed on the first day of the week. And we see that in Acts 20 and verse 7. Jared, would you read that for us?
And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight.
All right. Now, there's no question concerning the time period that's made mention of. It's upon the first day of the week. But it seems like that most of the questions or most of the controversy concerning Acts 20 and verse 7 centers upon that statement to break bread. And there's so many that can't understand and see that the breaking of bread here in Acts 20 and verse 7 has reference to the Lord's Supper. So how do we know that that phrase to break bread in Acts 20 and verse 7 has reference to the Lord's Supper? Well, we know that that phrase is used to refer to the Lord's Supper in a number of passages. One of those is Matthew 26:26. This is when Jesus institutes his supper. Sid, read that for us.
And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body.
All right, see, we have a breaking of bread here. He took bread and broke it. The breaking of bread. And what we have in Matthew's account, we can also read, but we won't take time, but in Mark's account, Mark 14, verse 22, Luke's account, Luke 22, and verse 19. Really the identical statements, because all three of these verses are referring to the same night in which Jesus instituted his supper. Now, another verse that the breaking of bread has reference to the Lord's Supper is Acts 2 and verse 42. And Brother Adams, would you read that for us?
And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayer.
All right, so this is the verse we know that is in the very beginning of the church in Jerusalem. And we see what it is that the church does. It continues to hold true to the apostles' doctrine, the fellowship, that is to the ministering to one another, the lay by and store that we could also refer to, the breaking of bread, and prayers. So all of this is spiritual in its context. So the breaking of bread is obviously in reference to the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 16. Brother Philip?
The cup of blessing, which we bless, it is not the communion of blood of Christ. The bread which we break, is not the communion of the body of Christ.
So again, another one of those passages where the bread which we break, the breaking of bread, obviously is in reference to the Lord's Supper because of the cup that's mentioned and because of the bread. These are being the two essential elements in the partaking of the Lord's Supper. Then there's that verse that we've read already, 1 Corinthians 11, verses 23 and 24, when Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. So again, the breaking of bread, and again, 1 Corinthians 11, being a reference to Matthew 26, where Jesus instituted the supper. Now, we do know that the phrase breaking of bread is used to refer to a common meal. And that we see in Acts 2 and verse 46. Hinton?
Then they waited for Gordon, breaking bread from house to house. They eat their food with gladness and simplicity of heart.
All right, so here we see the continuing daily in the temple, but the breaking of bread taking place from house to house. And that is what we're going to be seeing is in harmony with what other verses of scriptures teach concerning a common meal. So, two things that we must pay particular attention to in determining what was it they were doing in Acts 20 and verse 7. In the breaking of bread in Acts 20 and verse 7, was it a common meal or was it the Lord's Supper? So there are two things that we need to keep in mind. First of all, as always, one of the most elementary rules of Bible study, context. The context of Acts 20 and verse 7 is a worship assembly. We know that because Paul and those that were with him, they had waited 7 days. But Matthew 3 is verse 6.
But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days.
All right, this is Paul in the missionary journey. They sail away from Philippi. They are joined by others at Troas, and at Troas they stay 7 days. And then verse 7 says, upon the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. Now, they would not have waited 7 days if this is merely speaking of a common meal. Think about it. You want to go 7 days without a meal? Common meal? No. So we're seeing what the tarrying is done and what's taking place in verse 7 is not just the partaking of a common meal, but rather it is that of the Lord's Supper. The church at Troas came together. That's what verse 7 says. And that coming together is essential. It's necessary. It's a necessary part for the partaking of the Lord's Supper. Notice 1 Corinthians 11. I don't have this on the screen, but let's everybody who got a Bible, let's turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And I want to just to skip through and look at the verses in reference to the Lord's Supper and see what these verses are saying. 1 Corinthians 11. Notice verse 17, and I'm reading from the King James. Now in this that I declare unto you, I praise you not, that you come together, not for the better, but for the worse. Verse 18. But first of all, when you come together in the church, I hear that there's divisions among you, and I partly believe it. Verse 20. When you come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Notice verse 33. Wherefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, tarry one for another. And look at verse 34. If any man hunger, let him eat at home, that you come not together under condemnation. So there's no way that we can come away from 1 Corinthians 11 and understand that the Lord's Supper is something that can be done without there being a coming together. And that's what we see in Acts 20 and verse 7, a coming together. So, the context is important. They wait 7 days, and that's certainly not to be partaking of a common meal. The church came together, and that's what we see is necessary for the partaking of the Lord's Supper. It's not necessary for the partaking of a common meal, but for the Lord's Supper it is. And the other thing that the context shows us is that Paul preached to them. That was the word that was used in the King James. So, the context of Acts 20 and verse 7 is a worship assembly. And the second thing that we need to pay particular attention to is common meals were forbidden to be done as a part of the church's work. Going back to 1 Corinthians 11, Mike, read us verse 22 and verse 34.
What? Do you not have houses of seed to break in, or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. But if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment, and the rest I will set in order on account.
So what we see in these two verses is a clear showing by the inspired apostle that the Lord's Supper is something that is to be done as a part of the assembly of the church. But when it comes to a common meal, that is not a work of the church. That's not a function of the church. That's not something that the church is to provide to in any way maintain, support, you name it. Because that's something that clearly is to be done at home, not in the assembly, not associated with the church. So these two things helps us to see that in Acts 20 and verse 7, when they came together to break bread, it was not talking about a common meal whatsoever. For the fact of the context and for the fact that common meals as a part of the work or the function of the church is clearly condemned. Now, what the scriptures teach is that the Lord's Supper is to be observed every first day of the week. Now, what the first day of the week means is every first day. Somebody said, well, that's not in the verse. No, it's not in the verse E-V-E-R-Y, but it is in the verse if we understand anything at all concerning the statement that is given as to when something is to be done. In 1 Corinthians 16, why do you read that for us, verse 2?
On the first day of every week, each one of you is put aside and saved, as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come.
Now that's a rendering that we can find in the New American Standard, the English Standard Version, the International, New International Version, and the Revised Standard Version. It says, on the first day of every week. Now, going back to Acts 20 and verse 7, the word every is not there. It is, but it isn't. I say it is. Because It just takes very simple thinking to realize that it's there. I want us to consider some statements. Club meets on Monday. What's that mean? Just as sure as there is a Monday, the club's going to meet, right? Club meets on Monday. What about this statement? You will be paid on Friday. I don't think we have any trouble with that one. You know, your employer says you'll be paid Friday. Okay? I understand that. I understand that payday's Friday. I understand that just as sure as there is a Friday, I will be paid. Because that's what he said. Payday's Friday. So we don't have any difficulty with understanding how often that I'm going to be paid. Saturday is double time. That's another one that don't take no explanation. That means if I'm working on Saturday, just as sure as I work on Saturday, I get double pay. Because Saturday is double pay day. We don't have any problem with those very simple statements. Then what's the problem with upon the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread? You see, if something is said to take place weekly, the day of the week is stated. Just like what we said a moment ago, club meets Monday. Okay, that's the statement of a day of the week. So that means that it takes place weekly because the day of the week is specified. If something is to take place annually, then the day of the year is going to be stated. July 4th. What is that? That's a holiday. How many times does it take place? Just one. Because we have the month and the day of the month, and that's a day in the month of the year. So we understand July 4th is an annual, one time a year celebration. And if something is said to take place monthly, then the day of the month is stated. All you have to do is just understand that something takes place monthly is to give the 15th of the month. And that will stand for January, February, March, April, May, all the way through December. We have many things under the Old Testament that the Israelites were to remember as either a memorial or as a feast. And in giving those memorials and feasts and the particulars of how they were to be observed, we go to the Scriptures. We read what the Scriptures teach concerning the particulars of what's to be done in the observance of those memorials or those feasts. But also, there is the time that's specified. And in that time that's specified, we can understand and know how often that memorial, that feast, is to be observed. Take, for instance, the Passover. We go to Exodus 12, verse 6, verse 14, and verse 24, and there we read the particulars of what was to be done in observing the Passover. But also in those verses, it states the 14th day of the first month. What does that tell us about how often the Passover was observed? If it's to be on the 14th day of the first month, that means it's an annual observance. Because the day of the month, the day and the month is specified. So it's an annual observance. The Feast of Trumpets, we read about it in Leviticus 23 and verse 24. There we see the particulars of what's to be done But also we read that that was a feast that was to take place the first day of the 7th month. And that is an annual observance. That's how often the Feast of Trumpets was to be observed. Then there's the atonement. This is when the high priest goes into the most holy and offers up the sacrificial lamb to atone for the sins, for his sins and for the sins of the people. We read about it in Leviticus 23, verse 27. The particulars of what he's supposed to do. But what we also find is that that was something that took place on the 10th day of the 7th month. So the atonement was only done once a year. It was an annual thing. 10th day, 7th month. The Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. Leviticus 23, verses 39 through 44. The particulars are given, but also the time. The 15th day of the 7th month. That indicates that the Feast of Booths was an annual event. Then we have the Sabbath. In Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11, what's to be done. And we know that it's the 7th day of the week, because all we have to do is to see verse 11. The Sabbath is the 7th day. So there's no question. The Bible says what day of the week that the Sabbath is. It's the 7th day. All right? That tells us that the Sabbath was not an annual. Why? Because a specific day of the week is given. So that indicates the Sabbath was a weekly observance. Just as sure as there was a 7th day, the Sabbath was to be observed. And that's what we see in reference to the Lord's Supper. Acts 20 and verse 7. The first day of the week. That indicates a weekly observance because the day of the week has been specified. Really, too, we see a parallel between the Sabbath and the Old Testament. In Exodus 20, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. We know that the Sabbath, as we said a moment ago, was on the 7th day, because 2 verses down from Exodus 20 and verse 8 and verse 10, it says, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. So therefore, every time there was a 7th day, the Israelites understood that that was the day to be kept holy. Every week has a 7th day. 7th day is the Sabbath. The command is to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. So just as sure as there's a 7th day, it's a Sabbath day, we need to keep it holy. Is that not similar to what we read in Acts 20 and verse 7 in regards to the Lord's Supper? Except here, it's the first day of the week. But we're still involved in a day of the week, which indicates a weekly observance. So upon the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. Every time there is a first day of the week, the Lord's Supper is to be observed. So the same reasoning, the same logic applies to whether we're talking about the Sabbath or the observance of the Lord's Supper, does it not? Every time there is the first day of the week, we are to come together to break bread. I believe that if we can understand how often that the Jews observed the Sabbath, we can also understand how often Christians are to observe the Lord's Supper. And that there's nothing in Exodus 20 and verse 8 that says, remember every Sabbath. It says, remember the Sabbath day. And the Sabbath day is the 7th day. Acts 20 verse 7, upon the first day of the week. As sure as there is a first day, there is to be the observance of the Lord's Supper. So in conclusion of our study, though the majority of the Catholic and Protestant world partakes of the Lord's Supper on any day of the week, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, or annually, let us follow the approved example of the apostles and the early church and partake of it every first day of the week. Any questions, any comments? Our next study is a long thing to really can narrow it down. And that is, when taking the Lord's Supper, we're going to still be talking about the aspect of the Lord's Supper. In taking the Lord's Supper, the unleavened bread literally becomes the body and the flesh of Christ. And the fruit of the vine literally becomes the blood of Christ. And I said we can sum all that up. What we're dealing with here is the doctrine of transubstantiation. And there are a lot of people that believe that when you eat of that unleavened bread and you drink of that fruit of the vine, you are literally eating Christ's flesh, because some miraculous transformation takes place that turns that into the literal flesh and the literal blood of our Savior. And I'm going to have to ask Rodney to help me next Wednesday night. The church in Coleman is having a different speaker on Wednesday evenings on the assigned subjects. And this coming Wednesday night, I've been asked to do a lesson on premillennialism. So I appreciate Rodney for his willingness and his capability to stand in my place this coming Wednesday night, Lord willing. Any comments, any questions?
Make a comment just for our young people that might help them, because I think this is something that's been building for decades. Brethren have started to depart from this. You know, you read more and more, you break bread on any day, and but something that really strengthens that Acts 20 argument is the fact that when Luke, if he's the writer, records that, he names Paul and his companions. And they were from all over the world. Like he mentions them. And what it proves is, to me, when I'm talking about an approved example, is kind of the universality of it. That it wasn't just Troasians. We really don't know who all was there. We know Eutychus was named. But what we do know, though, see, is brethren from all over the world were there. And it shows that, that the Apostle Paul broke bread on Sunday. So be ye followers of me as I follow Christ. But the point is, I think that is really noteworthy when you're arguing that or discussing it, that it takes time. Luke says, and Sopater of Berea accompanied him to Asia. That's Paul. Also Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians. See, here's the Thessalonian church. Here's brethren from over there. And then, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy and Tychicus and Trophimus of Asia. These men going ahead waited for us at Troas. So there, at least 8 were there. Paul would make 8, 7 named. Luke includes himself. They waited for us. But these men going ahead waited, but we sailed away after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas. You got those men there from all over the world, where we say 7 days. Now, on the first day of the week, when the disciples, Paul, we got brethren from all over at this meeting, and then Paul preaches. We know he's right there in the middle of it. But point being that it kind of shows the universality of it to me, that it wasn't just an arbitrary meeting of a few brethren at Troas. That's what they argued. Is that it was just Troas as just kind of a day they picked for themselves. But that's not so at all, according to the context.
That's a good point. It's kind of like what we see in 1 Corinthians 16, Paul is